All right, hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our event, Why Low Carbon Fuel Won't Solve the Climate Crisis. My name is Kate Schwanhauser, and I am the Special Events Manager here at Food and Water Watch. And so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Our topic today, there's a lot of proposed solutions to help reduce our carbon emissions, and some of them are more credible than others. So we've got a great group of speakers here today who are going to dig into a few of the programs you might have heard about and share some of the behind the scenes information that the fossil fuel industry maybe doesn't want you to know about. So before we get into that conversation, I have a couple of announcements and some helpful Zoom reminders to get us started. So first, the chat box is open, so feel free to introduce yourself and keep an eye out there. That's where we'll be sharing some links during the event. If you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, please click on the live transcript button in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. We will also have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, so please use the Q&A box to send in any questions for the speakers. Finally, I'm recording today's event, so if you would like to watch this again later, share it with friends, that will be available in the next couple of days. I have a couple of upcoming events that I want to share with you, but first I want to give a quick shout out to everyone who has participated in our Walk the Talk challenge. So for the past 15 days, there has been an incredible group of people who has committed at least 15 minutes a day to taking action to protect our food, water, and climate. So these folks have been making calls to support legislation. They've been sharing petitions for signature, planting pollinator gardens, writing letters to the editor at their local papers, and so much more. It's been really inspiring to see all the different ways that everyone has rolled up their sleeves and gotten to work. And I see some of you in the chat here today, Deirdre, Sarah, Laura, Margie, Jimmy, Oriana. Thank you all so much for joining me in this challenge for the past 15 days. It's been so much fun to take action alongside you. Today is the last day of the challenge. So everyone, please give them a round of applause in the chat, and thank you for walking the talk with us. All right, so now some of those upcoming events that I mentioned. Next Thursday, June 23rd, we are hosting a virtual film premiere for Dear President Biden, which is a new short documentary about leaders in the fossil fuel resistance movement who are fighting to protect communities, water, and public health. It spotlights the urgency of the climate crisis and President Biden's responsibility to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. So we'll screen the film, it's 35 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion with the filmmaker John Bowermaster and some of the scientists and climate activists who are featured in the film. We will put a link in the chat where you can sign up for that. And then next month on July 20th, we will be talking about how we can protect manatees. With summer upon us, we know there are bound to be harmful algae blooms, unfortunately, in their habitats. And that's a big threat to manatees. And two of the big culprits are factory farms, whose runoff is polluting the water systems, and power plants along the coastline. So we'll put a link in the chat for that as well. And finally, some exciting news. We just launched registration for Against All Odds, which is our annual benefit. I know that sometimes the path ahead can feel daunting, but no matter the difficulty, no matter the odds, Food and Water Watch will keep fighting, and we know that you stand with us in that commitment. Corporations might have the money, but we believe it's the power of people that truly matters, and together we can protect the climate and our planet. So this will be a hybrid event, which means you can join us from anywhere in the country, from the comfort of your home like you are today. Or if you live in New York City, you can join us for an in-person reception. Whichever you choose, we'll hear from some special guests and we'll celebrate and mobilize for the work ahead. Tickets to the benefit are a donation to Food and Water Watch, and with your investment, we are building the grassroots power needed to solve the most pressing food, water, and climate issues of our time. Plus, each ticket comes with fun, unique perks like a t-shirt or a one-of-a-kind poster that you can customize and bring to your next rally, and lots of other fun things. So for those who do prefer to join us virtually, and as a thank you for participating in today's event and some of our other virtual events, we do have a discount code that you can use for special pricing on specific virtual ticket levels. That code is valid until July 11th, so definitely check that out soon, and we'll put those details in the chat. All right, so let's get to it. I am going to turn things over now to our host and moderator for today, Jim Walsh, who is our policy director here at Food and Water Watch. So welcome, Jim. I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate all of the work that you and your team do to put together these great educational forums for our members and supporters. It's so valuable. And I want to thank all of you for being here in the audience today, for being here as well. Our volunteers, donors, activists, allies, people who send emails. All of this is what makes our work possible. So thank you very much for doing that. And the work we have to do is really important. When we talk about the climate crisis, I think it's important to remember that, the climate crisis is not some far off thing that we need to stop before it's too late. Climate change is upon us, and it's increasing the intensity of droughts, heat waves, wildfires, flooding, tropical storms, sea level rise. And for many people around the world and here in the US who are losing loved ones to heat waves, whose homes and businesses were lost in fires and other disasters, climate change is all too real for them today. And the work we do now is really about working to prevent things from getting worse, to cut off and stop the worst impacts from climate change from happening, so that we can actually preserve a livable future for ourselves and future generations. And so in the move to address the climate crisis, I'm sure many of you have probably heard about plans to reach net zero emissions and striving for carbon neutral plans. And these plans are coming from governments and corporations and even oil companies are putting forward carbon neutral plans, which, to some people might sound great, to reach carbon neutrality. But in reality, these net zero plans are based on this mindset of a failed market-based regulatory approach to the climate crisis that has taken hold in California and is harming our climate. And not just the climate, but also harming communities around the country, and not just in California with this regulatory program. And so even though we're talking about a regulatory program in California, this is something that actually is impacting people around the United States and propping up dirty energy projects all over. And these market-based schemes really have two components in California, the low carbon fuel standard, and then there's also the California cap and trade program. And these programs at their very base level are encouraging this net zero policy that encourages and continues the fossil fuel industry. And, essentially these aren't actually intended to reduce overall carbon emissions, but they let polluters pollute as long as they can offset their emissions. And it just basically means moving pollution around somewhere else to someone else's backyard. And those offsets include things like carbon capture, energy production from hydrogen can be included in this, factory farm biogas, and other biofuels like ethanol. Are being propped up in this program. And despite what the fossil fuel industry says, these are not clean energy solutions. And when companies like Exxon and Shell and BP get out and say, we're going to be carbon neutral, we really have to think, like, does that term really mean anything? And at the end of the day, it means very little. We've embedded these schemes now are based in this oil and gas industry frame about climate neutrality. And what we need to do is actually transition to policies that are going to keep fossil fuels in the ground. By saying net zero and carbon neutrality, we're actually supposed to forget about all the other problems with fossil fuel development, the water and air pollution that comes from the fossil fuel industry and fracking, pipelines and combustion, because the problems go far beyond carbon in the atmosphere, although that is a major problem with the fossil fuel industry. We're supposed to believe that planting trees is going to somehow offset all these problems from the fossil fuel industry, which we know they aren't and won't. And what's worse is these pushes in Washington, D.C. Are happening in Washington, D.C. as well, and internationally. There are policies like the Growing Climate Solutions Act and Bill Sachs' Climate Smart Agriculture Program through the USDA, which are really about laying the groundwork for national carbon offset and cap and trade programs that would happen nationally. And there's also discussions that just happened at recent climate discussions about expanding access to international carbon trading markets and expanding those markets. And so when we're looking at California's low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade, we're looking at them because they're a cautionary tale of what happens when we embrace carbon trading nationally and internationally, which many leaders around the globe are pushing for right now. And we know that how to solve the crisis. It's about going after the fossil fuel and industrial agriculture producers that are driving the climate crisis forward and actually phasing those industries out and pushing for the infrastructure for a rapid transition off of fossil fuels. And it's really at the core is what we need to do. It's not about counting carbon emissions. It's about cutting off the sources of carbon where they form. And that's in the drilling industry and factory farms primarily. And so without further ado, you guys didn't come here to listen to me, but to all of our great speakers. And so I first want to introduce Tyler Lobdell, who's a staff attorney with Food and Water Watch. And he's going to discuss the problems and issues with factory farming and biogas, which is significantly propped up by this program, these programs that we're discussing today. And Tyler is somebody who uses legal and advocacy really to combat factory farms and the systems that prop up this dangerous industry. He works on these issues at the national, regional, and local level, and is a longtime environmentalist. He spent almost 10 years leading conservation programs across the U.S. before entering law school, and we're really glad to have him now. It's here today and with Food and Water Watch in general. So Tyler, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Jim. And I'll just echo what Jim said. And it's really encouraging to see so many of our members and supporters show up for an event like this to learn about these really, really critical issues. So just really appreciate everyone in the audience today. So as Jim said, I'm going to talk about what the fossil fuel and factory farm industries like to call quote unquote biogas, what Food and Water Watch and others more accurately describe as factory farm gas, well, because that's where it's produced, it's where it comes from. And so to take a step back, what is biogas in general? Like, what are we talking about here? So biogas as a general matter can be produced from a whole variety of what are called feedstocks or organic waste streams. And so biogas is produced by typically through what are called anaerobic digesters, which are large holding tanks essentially that create an oxygen-free environment. So anaerobic just means without oxygen. A waste stream is put into that oxygen-free environment, and then what are called methanogenic bacteria are introduced. That just means bacteria that when they kind of do their thing, when they essentially eat, the byproduct is the creation of methane gas, which is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, approximately 89 times more powerful than carbon dioxide on a 20-year time span. And so we're talking about the creation of new greenhouse gases that affect the climate. So essentially we have these tanks that create the oxygen-free environment. You put the waste in, you introduce the bacteria, they create this methane and other gases, and then that gas is captured and used in some way. Okay, so that general idea is now being applied to factory farm waste, to the unfathomable amounts of pollution that these industrial facilities accumulate and aggregate in small areas, which creates this enormous waste management conundrum. And both the fossil fuel industry and the factory farm industry talk about factory farm gas as a climate win and as a way to make factory farms less devastating to the environment and to public health. Unfortunately, both of those buckets of claims are little more than corporate greenwashing. And for folks who aren't familiar with that term, haven't heard it before, it simply is when a company uses marketing or a false solution like this to cover up or hide its environmental or public health impacts while maintaining business as usual in reality. And so quite to the contrary of these greenwashing claims, factory farm gas has two major threats. And so first, the adoption and promotion of factory farm gas locks in decades of reliance on the dirty natural gas pipeline systems, fracked gas, and really the entire existing natural gas system that we all know is hurtling us towards climate chaos. Okay, and then on the factory farm side of things, factory farm gas production is fundamentally dependent on some of the most dangerous practices that large factory farms use. So you don't have meaningful factory farm gas production without huge factory farms that manage their waste in intentionally unsustainable ways, right? So I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail. And another aspect of the factory farm industry's greenwashing tactic is to talk about anaerobic digesters and to talk about quote unquote biogas as a way to solve factory farming's waste management conundrum. Unfortunately, the exact opposite is true in terms of reality and science. So the two pollutants of biggest concern with factory farming waste are nutrients. So that's nitrogen and phosphorus. These are the pollutants that cause fish kills in our lakes, rivers, and streams. These are the pollutants that cause harmful algal blooms that Kate mentioned earlier that can kill people, pets, and wildlife. These are the pollutants that poison groundwater and people's drinking water with nitrates, which can cause a whole host of cancers, blue baby syndrome, premature births, thyroid diseases, etc. Anaerobic digesters make those pollutants more hazardous to the environment by changing their chemical composition, which makes them more likely to end up in our lakes, rivers, and streams, and more likely to leach into people's drinking water. So again, while the factory farm industry would like the public to think that they are making a responsible choice here and improving their environmental footprint, in reality, they're doing the exact opposite to make more money. Shocker, right? Okay, and just to give a really shocking example of how this is a false climate solution, and when I said it will increase our dependence on fracked gas, this is what I mean. Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer in the United States, has partnered with several energy companies around the country. One of them has publicly stated that if they can source 4% of their entire gas mix that they put into their pipelines from Smithfield factory farms, their entire system will be carbon neutral. Okay, so 4% factory farm gas, 96% fracked gas, and they're going to tell us that they are not a problem for climate change anymore, which is objectively absurd. Okay, so this is the scope of the greenwashing that we're being confronted with. Now, unfortunately, despite these realities, despite these scientific truths, support for factory farm gas has been significantly growing in the past few years. And that's largely due to the low carbon fuel standard out of California that Jim mentioned. And that's because the program is fundamentally flawed in such a way that it's providing an enormous financial windfall for these factory farm gas projects. So what is the LCFS? The low carbon fuel standard is a program that is supposed to lower the greenhouse gas impacts of transportation fuel, so trucks and cars, in the state of California. Unfortunately, it's perversely rewarding more greenhouse gas emissions and rewarding the biggest polluters out there. Like if you're the biggest polluter gets the biggest payout, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. So the way the low carbon fuel standard works is essentially as Jim described. It's a pollution trading scheme. So on one side of the program are fossil transportation fuel providers, so Chevron, who makes and delivers gasoline and diesel. They're what are called deficit holders. So the state of California has placed a cap on the greenhouse gas emissions that can be associated with their fossil fuels. And it's necessarily lower than what fossil fuel production entails. And so instead of simply emitting less to comply with California law, they go out and they buy these credits from the other side of the ledger, which are called credit generators. And those are projects that produce alternative fuels that have a lower greenhouse gas impact than conventional fossil fuels, right? And so I'm the credit generator over here. I sell my credit to Chevron, who can then continue business as usual and not actually stop polluting the climate, okay? And so this takes us to factory farm gas and how that fits into it. Oh, and I should flag, as Jim noted, the low carbon fuel standard program, while a California program, is impacting communities all around the country when it comes to factory farm gas. We have factory farms as far away as Wisconsin, Minnesota, upstate New York, generating credits under this program and polluting their local environment as a result. So the fundamental metric that creates value for a credit generator for these alternative fuel producers is what's called the carbon intensity of their fuel. And I raise this because this is really critical to why factory farm gas is so bizarre and twisted within this system. And that carbon intensity determines essentially how many credits you're going to be able to create and then sell to the Chevrons of the world. And because the state of California treats factory farms wildly unsustainable and harmful waste management practices, in other words, the lagoons that folks may have seen before, these massive cesspools that contain millions of gallons of manure and urine and other pollutants, the state of California treats those as naturally occurring phenomena, essentially unavoidable natural aspects of a landscape, as opposed to intentional production choices made by factory farmers to increase profit and deal with their waste in the most rudimentary, in the cheapest way possible. So it's a way to store and then dispose of their pollution and let local communities deal with the outfall. Okay, so because of that faulty baseline, because the state of California treats this horrible practice as unavoidable and a natural consequence of raising animals, these factory farm gas projects are assigned dramatically profitable carbon intensities. And to provide a really stark example of that, and these are two real programs or two real projects under the low carbon fuel standard right now, a solar array that directly feeds an electric vehicle charging station was assigned a 0 carbon intensity. A mega dairy with thousands of cows was assigned a negative 758 carbon intensity for capturing a small portion of the methane emissions that the facility intentionally generates to maximize their profits. So that just puts into stark relief the absurdity of how this program is operating. The biggest polluter gets the biggest payout. And if I'm a factory farmer and I dared to anywhere along the way make incremental improvements to how I manage my waste, such that I would have mitigated some of my methane emissions, I actually get punished by the state of California when I apply to the low carbon fuel standard. So there is an incentive to be the biggest, most irresponsible polluter because you get the most money out of this program. Okay, so the incentives are just completely backwards. And the result of this on the ground is what we have seen is what industry itself is calling a manure gold rush. We have venture capitalists and developers and energy companies going around the country trying to find the biggest, most polluting factory farms so they can partner with them and reap this financial windfall from the low carbon fuel standard. I live in Idaho. We're the third largest dairy producing state in the country. We have a robust factory farm industry. And there are literally people scouring our countryside, going from big factory farm to big factory farm, trying to go under contract with these facilities to profit off pollution, okay? And in reality, this is encouraging and entrenching all of the other harms with factory farming. As I noted before, anaerobic digesters are not a pollution control device. They are a way to make money off intentionally produced methane pollution. They do nothing for the host of co-pollutants. They also do nothing, it's mostly nothing, for the variety of nuisances that local communities have to deal with, which one of the other panelists is going to talk more about. And so it's this false solution that rewards the biggest polluters, entrenches both fracking, natural gas infrastructure, and the worst possible actors in our industrial animal agriculture system. And if we can drop in the chat in a moment here, we'd like to provide a really well done news article that kind of captures a lot of these arguments and these dynamics for folks to read up a little bit more on if they'd like. And so I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I'll just flag that the low carbon fuel standard has an intimate relationship with the other false solutions that the panelists are going to discuss. So that's carbon capture and sequestration is also rewarded unjustly under the program, as well as the burgeoning interest in hydrogen energy, which also threatens to be another sort of faulty backwards part of this overall program. So with that, I'll pass it off, and thank you again, everybody, again for being here.
Tyler, thank you so much for that presentation. I truly like how you laid out the disastrous factory farm industry, but how they and other polluters are hiding behind these greenwashing schemes to cover up how bad they are for our communities and our planet, and actually making things worse. And this comes to mind for me as I often hear people say, well, the climate situation is bad and we should be doing something is better than nothing. But as you point out, sometimes policies like this, particularly these carbon pricing schemes, are worse and leave us better off than doing nothing. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do nothing, but it means that we need to push for things that actually work and not things that are creating more harm for our communities and our planet. And our next speaker is Jamie Katz, who's a staff attorney with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability based in Fresno. And they are going to discuss more specific California impacts of factory farms into the communities that they work with, and how factory farm gas entrenches and exacerbates these harms. And Jamie leads on Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability's energy policy work, including legislation and the budget, as well as Public Utility Commission and Energy Commission, and also their work with the California Air Resource Board. Prior to joining the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, they were staff attorney for a legal aid organization representing clients on a number of civil issues, primarily eviction defense, and have experience as an environmental justice community organizer in New Orleans as well. And so, Jamie, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you to Food and Water Watch for the invitation today. Great to see Tyler. Food and Water Watch, just such an excellent partner to work on these issues with. So really appreciate the invitation. So I just have a couple minutes. So so Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, we work in California in the San Joaquin Valley and Eastern Coachella Valley, alongside about 30 of the most impacted communities in California. In the San Joaquin Valley in particular, we work alongside many communities that are near some of these industrial factory farms. And what we've seen in working with residents of the impact that these facilities are having in recent years, and as we've seen this trend of concentrated herds in communities. So I think it's not an accident that these facilities are located near low-income communities and communities of color in inland California. These are the result of racist land use and housing policies. And so what we see and what we hear from residents are, the impacts on their air, their drinking water, in addition to other impacts. I was actually just on a panel earlier today at a convening about asthma. And was reminded, just seeing it laid out, the most impacted communities with regard to PM 2.5 and ozone in the top couple are consistently Bakersfield and then the Fresno region. So in the San Joaquin Valley, in the same places where we're seeing some of the largest dairies in the country. We're also seeing, impacts on folks' drinking water, where we're seeing, there was a report from the dairy industry in California itself, where they found that every single dairy that they monitored had elevated levels of nitrate in the drinking water below the dairies. And so for residents who live nearby, that means they're drinking contaminated water. Not a surprise probably to anyone on this call. I think in addition to that, what residents face are, the smell of dairy, residents reporting that the smell, it makes it into their homes, makes it into their clothes, and then the impact of flies. And these sort of nuisance impacts don't often get captured in a lot of conversations about dairies and about the low carbon fuel standard and its impact, but it's a huge quality of life impact for residents. And so it just always needs to be elevated. And I think so what we're seeing the low carbon fuel standard doing is actually incentivizing the further concentration of these herds into these already pollutioned communities. Again, some of the worst air in the country, contaminated water, and as Tyler laid out, the installation of a dairy digester and this factory farm gas pipeline infrastructure does nothing to mitigate those impacts. And in many cases makes them worse, both by changing the chemical composition of the digested manure, but also in the increased herd sizes, right? Because there's this incentive to concentrate more animal herds. And I think, it's been a challenge. So what we're seeing on the ground, right, is from residents is that we're seeing these already large facilities get larger. So dairies with thousands of cows go to, adds 1,000 more cows. We've seen a facility go from 10,000 to 20,000 cows. We just saw an application last week for a dairy in Merced County that is going from about 4,000 cows to about 6,500 cows. And what we're seeing when these applications from when these dairies are applying for credit through the low carbon fuel standard, the Air Resources Board treats their herd size as a private business information, and so redacts that information. So it's very difficult for communities to track. But we're seeing through local permitting that these herd sizes are increasing. We're hearing from residents that they are, and it's either happening before or immediately after the installation of biogas equipment. And so we're seeing the concentration of herds around this infrastructure. And so, again, just to reiterate that these herds concentrating are adding additional pollution burden to the most pollution burdened communities, and it creates additional challenges because we work with many residents who are showing up to public meetings to elevate these concerns, but many residents work with dairies and fear losing their jobs if they speak out. So it creates additional challenges. But I think the key thing here is that the low carbon fuel standard is incentivizing the worst the worst dairy management practices, and is entrenching and exacerbating pollution burden on communities here in the San Joaquin Valley. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie, very much for sharing about your work and experience working directly with communities that are being harmed by the factory farming industry. And I appreciate particularly you really pointing out that people located near these polluting facilities tend to be low-income people of color. We know that this isn't accidental. There's deliberate long-term ongoing policies that continue to put this infrastructure in communities that harm disadvantaged communities. And I would like to, we'll share in chat in a little bit a recent a study that Food and Water Watch did a couple of years ago that talks about how these carbon trading programs are actually concentrating pollution in low-income communities in particular. And so thank you very much. And we're going to turn now to Mackenzie, who is going to discuss expansion of mega dairies in Oregon. And we're talking about Oregon because we pointed out earlier is that although this is a California program and it's harming people in California, all over the country, polluters are able to participate in this program and profit from it. And in Oregon, they're gaining these public subsidies from this California Net Zero program. And so Mackenzie comes to us as an organizer with Food and Water Watch, and her work focuses on really putting a stop to these mega dairies in the state, with an emphasis on protecting our air, water, climate, and also family dairy farmers and protecting the health and well-being of the rural communities where these farms are located. Prior to working in Oregon, Mackenzie had worked alongside activists in Iowa to also secure a livable future for rural communities there. So Mackenzie, I'll turn it on to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for having me on. My name is Mackenzie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an Oregon organizer here at Food and Water Watch, working to stop the expansion of mega dairies here in our state. As I know you all have heard a lot about factory farm gas, the low carbon fuel standard, and what's happening in California, I wanted to take a moment to zoom out because unfortunately what happens in California when it comes to false solutions often doesn't just stay in California. It impacts people across the nation. And I'm going to focus on Oregon because that's the state where I live and work and where we have seen the factory farm industry expand. And the low carbon fuel standard has only made matters worse. And, I think our state is an example of how once an industry gets a whiff of interest in something or senses a political appetite for a false solution, they really do everything they can to make it a reality, which is why we really can't buy into the idea that these false solutions are temporary, because one, we know that they're not, and two, they prop up dangerous climate polluters as they operate. So just to kind of start off, a mega dairy is an operation that confines 2,500 or more cows at a time. That's how we define it. In Oregon, we currently have 11 mega dairies that are actually operating and many more that are permitted as mega dairies, but not yet operating at full capacity. So mega dairies in general are bad for the planet, as you've heard other speakers talk about. They drive out sustainable family dairy farms, they use massive amounts of water, they pollute our waterways, and they emit methane that warms our climate. And some estimates show that factory farm dairies produce more than twice as many emissions as pasture-based dairy farms. And those emissions add up. Already, Oregon's mega dairies spew 17 million kilograms of planet warming methane each year, which is the same as the emissions of 318,000 passenger vehicles. And, just to put that into perspective, that's more emissions than all of the registered vehicles in Marion County, which is home to Oregon's state capital. So this is a significant amount of emissions that we're talking about. And that stat is based on a new fact sheet that we just published that we'll put in the chat for you all to dig into a little bit more after this. But I'd like to make this issue of mega dairies and low carbon fuel standard a little bit more real by diving into a specific example. So 3 Mile Canyon Farms is a large mega dairy, really kind of ground zero in terms of industry expansion in Oregon. And it's massive. It has almost 70,000 cows on its property, and it was one of the first to come into Oregon, and now new thousands on thousand head mega dairies just down the road from this operation. Again, showing that when an industry sees an opportunity, it really runs with it. The county that this mega dairy is located is called Morrow County, and it's home to a large Latinx population. About 3 times the amount of Latinx folks live in Morrow County as compared to the state as a whole, adding a layer of racial and environmental justice into this issue. And for years, this county has been saturated with nitrate contamination in the water supply, made worse by the likes of 3 Mile Canyon. And just last week, the county declared a state of emergency because of the nitrates in the water. And it's also a county that is currently under drought declaration status by the governor. And with all these issues, the industry has continued to make matters worse. Instead of cleaning up their act, they've decided to avoid accountability. I know, absolutely shocking. By placing a factory farm gas digester on their property to rebrand their manure, their pollution essentially, as sustainable. And, the creation of factory farm gas relies on the continued expansion and exploitation of the community living nearest to factory farms that have to deal with the air and water pollution and broader impacts on their quality of life. And I just want to make sure we remember that. So 3 Mile Canyon unfortunately followed the money and built a digester operation and currently receives credits from California's low carbon fuel standard because, California has decided to prop up and incentivize this dirty industry. Oregonians are paying the price with climate change inducing and water polluting mega dairies and having to also deal with the risks of transporting this gas from Eastern Oregon. And just to put a finer point on this, to really kind of hammer home on the impact of the low carbon fuel standard, the previous manager of 3 Mile Canyon Farms even said that, quote, the most valuable product that we have out there is natural gas, when talking about the mega dairy operation and the digester on their property. So now, instead of being created to produce milk and supporting milk products, mega dairies are being expanded and propping up gas, the production of gas. I think this is really one of those cases where the industry is trying to avoid changing at any cost and creating, 10 other problems when we could really just solve this problem by stopping the expansion of mega dairies. And I also want to flag, digesters themselves are full of hazards. They often leak, they emit their own harmful pollutants into the air, and can explode and injure folks nearby. And this year we uncovered that the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality had fined the digester at 3 Mile Canyon Farms for violating their air quality permit. And we were able to respond quickly by issuing a letter to the California Air Resources Board about this violation, since the digester was receiving credits while in violation of their air quality permit. And Oregon's Food and Water Watch members were able to echo that call by sending their own letters into the California Air Resources Board, alerting them of this violation. And we will continue to monitor these violations, since, just last month, unfortunately, we saw another digester that was fined for violating its air permit, allowing, countless amounts of pollution into the air. So that is kind of the state that we are at with mega dairies and the low carbon fuel standard here in Oregon. But I do want to talk a little bit about the good news and how residents are fighting back. In addition to kind of calling out that air quality violation, we've had some other great wins. We, along with countless allies and activists, were able to shut down a 30,000 head mega dairy, so that we know change can happen. But ultimately, the solution that we need to fix this problem and to stop the expansion of factory farm gas is stopping mega dairy expansion, to halt the ability for these digesters to have the raw materials, the manure, to operate and create this gas. So that's the solution that we've been calling for. And people in Oregon have really showed up to answer that call. In late 2021, we delivered a petition to the governor calling on her to deny a recent mega dairy application, and over 1,400 Oregonians took action in just a few weeks to support that petition. We also have run moratorium bills in previous sessions where over 100 people submitted testimony in support, compared to the barely over 20 comments against the bill dominated by the industry. And we continue to talk to legislators, raise the issue and more, and we'll continue to do just that until, pardon this pun, the cows come home, or rather until the cows come home to pasture-based farms. So thank you so much. I hope that helped illustrate that these false solutions are only moving us farther away from a livable future, and where you really need to stop this industry from expanding in order to solve the problem.
That was really great. I really appreciate all the work that folks are doing in Oregon. But I found the statement that Mackenzie made about how factory farms are now moving to producing factory farm gas as a primary purpose for factory farming. And this is very different than the industry's kind of initial frame that, well, we need to do factory farming to, and since we need to do factory farming, we can mitigate it with these biogas facilities and digesters. But, reality now, we're just moving towards making factory farms as like a new form of fracking wells at some level, where we're going to just create these monstrosities to produce dirty energy, and regardless of what happens. And it just really exposes how this industry is concerned about nothing other than profits. Our next speaker is Emma Schmidt, who will discuss another climate scam that's propping up the big fossil fuel corporations and agricultural interest. And this is carbon capture, which is also getting a lot of support from these California programs. And Emma is a senior organizer with Food and Water Watch, and she's based in Northwestern Iowa and has been organizing with Food and Water Watch since 2018. She got her start organizing against the Dakota Access Pipeline and has since worked with Iowans across the state to fight the corporate takeover of our agricultural systems. She's currently working to stop 3 proposed carbon capture pipelines in Iowa. So Emma, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. I did request to be introduced as M-Dog, but that's fine. I mean, it's not really, but we'll both just have to live with that consequence. So, but to kick us off, I'm going to take us all the way back to the beginning. So 13.8 billion years ago, what scientists refer to as a Big Bang. I'm actually being told I only have a few minutes. So we're going to go ahead and fast forward a couple billion years to when this technology called CCS, or carbon capture and storage, started being explored. It's a fairly new technology that that really got its kickstart in 2008 when Congress approved tax credits for companies practicing CCS. But we'll come back to that in just a minute. First, let's talk about what CCS actually is. So carbon capture and storage is essentially made up of 3 steps. First, carbon dioxide is captured and separated from the other gases at the smokestack of a polluting entity. So power plants have often been the most commonly discussed source, but in our case here in Iowa, the plan is to capture the carbon released largely from ethanol and fertilizer plants. In the second step, the carbon dioxide is compressed and it's shipped off for storage. Since it can only be stored in certain geological formations, it has to be transported these long distances through a series of pipelines. And pipelines that, of course, are at a risk for rupturing or leaking potentially lethal amounts of carbon dioxide, which is an asphyxiant for miles around. Finally, on that happy note, the CO2 is then injected underground, typically into salt caverns or old oil and gas fields. Now, in most cases, the carbon is injected into nearly depleted oil fields for a process known as enhanced oil recovery. You could sort of compare it to fracking, except in this case, they're using carbon instead of water to bring up the last dregs of oil. And continuing our reliance on fossil fuels is a terrible move in the first place, right? But to make it even more insulting, carbon capture is being greenwashed and sold to us as a solution to the climate crisis, despite increasing the longevity of the oil and gas industry, despite requiring massive amounts of energy for the capture, transportation, utilization, and the storage of carbon, and the greenhouse gas output that comes with it. So we know that these massive industries, like the oil industry, have never, ever given a damn about our climate. And they haven't magically started caring now, because CCS isn't about our environment, it's about money. So as I mentioned earlier, back in 2008, Congress added Section 45Q to the tax code to encourage carbon capture technology. And under 45Q, a corporation can earn up to $50 for every ton of carbon they sequester, or they can profit $35 for every ton of carbon used for enhanced oil recovery. Of the 12 facilities that are currently operating in the US, all but 1 use the carbon for enhanced oil recovery. This tax credit can be claimed for 12 years as of right now, and there are very real concerns about the oversight and the ability of corporations to report fraudulent numbers. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that was passed by Congress last year also provides over $12 billion in subsidies for CCS, including $2.1 billion in loan guarantees for CCS, $320 million for mapping underground storage areas, $115 million in direct air capture technology, $2.5 billion in CCS research, and another $2.5 billion in pilot projects. And this, massive sum of money is all on top of the $8 billion that we've already invested in demo projects and research since 2010, projects and research that have shown us one thing, that carbon capture and storage does not work. But what does this have to do with the low carbon fuel standard? If you were paying attention, which I hope you were, because there will be a pop quiz, maybe, we'll see, probably not, who can say? Yeah, we'll find out. But you'll remember that I mentioned ethanol facilities are the latest operations investing in CCS. And that is because of California's low carbon fuel standard. There have been pretty significant concerns, specifically by Midwestern states and namely Iowa, about the looming decline of ethanol. And there's no denying that ethanol is an important part of Iowa's economy. However, the last decades of agriculture have seen farmers just endlessly cycling through boom and bust phases. And dedicating more than 40% of Iowa's cropland to growing corn just for ethanol certainly hasn't put an end to the perpetual highs and lows of the ag economy. But rather than promoting a stabilized system that would actually protect farmers and allow them to thrive, these massive agriculture and energy companies are continuing to push ethanol as the solution to farm prosperity. Ethanol has always been sold to us as a bridge fuel, not a forever fuel. We can do far better for our farmers and our communities than slapping on another Band-Aid. Over the last 20-some years as well, we've seen a growing focus on lowering our carbon footprint. But as it currently stands, corn ethanol in the United States has a carbon intensity close to that of coal. So in order to foster the industry's longevity, Ethanol manufacturers are partnering with carbon capture corporations to trap their dirty carbon emissions. And by doing so, it lowers the company's carbon footprint and it opens up a new market in low carbon fuels, which of course, California, with the largest state economy in the US, is just one state where we can expect this newly minted low carbon ethanol to be marketed. So because of how the low carbon fuel standard operates, we're not only entrenching ethanol, but we're also driving CCS and in turn, the oil industry. Despite the intention of addressing the climate crisis, what we're seeing in reality is simply more of the same. Big businesses are being propped up while people on the ground continue to burden the consequences. But it's not all bad news. In Iowa here, we're fed up with the corporate control of our state. So we're fighting back. Through the 3 proposed carbon pipelines, we've been able to unite Iowans across the state of all backgrounds behind the same battle cry to stop the CCS build out. From landowners to impacted counties, people and agencies are objecting to the pipelines through a variety of ways, locally, legislatively, and legally. So we're not willing to sacrifice our land or our futures so Wall Street can continue raking in profits. While we know we're up against these major industries and bad government policies, we also know that together we have the power to stop these dangerous greenwashing schemes. I think Jim is going to talk about how you two can get involved in the fight in just a moment. So I will pass it back over to him to keep this show on the road. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. And I'll try to remember your proper introduction next time. Thanks so much for coming to talk about the great work that you're doing in Iowa to fight these carbon capture scams that are really sweeping the country. And, it occurs to me listening to you talk and our other speakers too, is that, there's a collaboration between big agricultural interests and the fossil fuel interests that are marching lock and step to perpetuate these climate scams. And I appreciate how well you point out that these industries are collaborating very closely in Iowa with these CCS scams to keep their dirty exploitative practices going. So thank you very much for clearly articulating that. And next we'll hear from our final speaker, Jorge Aguilar, who's our Southern Region Director at Food and Water Watch. He's been organizing at the state and local level for nearly 15 years to protect our food, water, and climate. And today he's joining us to talk about hydrogen, yet another fossil fuel industry scam that's being propped up by these California programs. And, hydrogen's been gaining a lot of attention lately, mostly due to a well-oiled fossil fuel industry PR effort to convince the public and decision makers that hydrogen is a silver bullet for our energy and climate woes. But in reality, hydrogen production is expensive, it's inefficient, it's dirty, it's water intensive, and it amounts to little more than a fossil fuel industry plan to remarket fracked gas, because that's where 95% of the hydrogen in the country is coming from, is from natural gas, which is predominantly from fracking here in the United States. And the hydrogen build out is really doing little more than providing new markets for that fracked gas to fall into in this greenwashed manner. And so I'll turn it over to Jorge, who's going to talk more about this now. Thank you, Jorge.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you, Jim and team, for the great and illuminating discussion on these false solutions. My name is Jorge Aguilar, and I am the Southern Region Director for Food and Water Watch. And the team invited me today to chat about yet another false solution that's being touted as part of the new clean energy or net zero future. I'll reiterate what others have already said. We must be very, very vigilant about what actually counts as a clean energy, given some options are not actually very clean. Hydrogen has become a real buzzword in many communities, and I'll offer that it is because the oil and gas industry is really trying to convince the general public to support giving big oil billions of dollars in taxpayer money. You heard that right, billions of dollars. There's just a problem that producing fossil hydrogen releases 20% more carbon emissions than just burning natural gas. Yes, I said an eye-popping 20% more emissions. Experts have concluded that overall, hydrogen is worse than burning coal for the climate. That's because today, about 96% of all hydrogen production in the US is powered by, yes, fossil fuels. So the basic lesson that everyone should know about hydrogen is that it is produced by an industrial process that uses heat, steam, and pressure to split methane, also known as natural gas. So it splits it into hydrogen and a carbon dioxide byproduct. So because this carbon dioxide byproduct of hydrogen is a major problem, hydrogen production is now being used to prop up carbon capture and sequestration, which the team talked about earlier. And in so doing, creates a vicious circle that requires more and more fossil fuels. So right now, we need to get off of fossil fuels, but hydrogen would actually lock us into more fossil fuels, and that's just wrong. The worst part yet, perhaps, is that this would increase pollution in these facilities that generate fossil fuels, which are overwhelmingly located near communities of color and low-income areas. So the team really wanted me to share an example of what's going on with hydrogen by telling you a little bit about New Mexico. Right now, the governor there, Michelle Lujan Grisham, is really pushing to make New Mexico a hydrogen hub for the US. The plan is obscene, though, for several reasons. First off, New Mexico is a major oil and gas producer, ranking in the top 5 in the US. And hydrogen production would not reduce the drilling and fracking in the state. It would instead expand it and make it worse. A lot of the drilling that is happening right now is actually in indigenous lands, and hydrogen plus carbon capture would make the situation in these frontline communities that much more devastating. Luckily, and something to really cheer about, is that these frontline groups in New Mexico, alongside allies like Food and Water Watch, were able to defeat a state bill that the governor from New Mexico was pushing just earlier this year that sought to give the industry $125 million in subsidies for the goal of hydrogen production. But though that bill was defeated, the governor is now partnering with the leaders of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah to try to get the federal government to give the states money for launching a hydrogen program in those states. But perhaps the most immoral part of this hydrogen plan in New Mexico is that hydrogen production will use up enormous amounts of water. And right now, New Mexico is going through some of the most severe droughts in decades. So in addition to extreme heat and record-breaking wildfires in New Mexico, the drought is a serious disaster that will only be exacerbated by giving away water for hydrogen production. So at a time when communities are facing water shortages and really having to plan for a future, perhaps with much less water, New Mexico should not be prioritizing water for fossil hydrogen. Plain and simple, it is just wrong to give away water. That's why, like my other colleagues, we need to learn about hydrogen, why it's a false solution, and push to make sure that this hydrogen plan is completely shelved. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll turn it back over to the team.
Thank you, Jorge, very much for these comments. I can tell with the chat blowing up that hydrogen is certainly a topic that our members and supporters are very interested in and also very educated about as well, which is great to hear, because I think that, in many instances, the public at large isn't up to speed on a lot of these fossil fuel industry scams. So I appreciate your comments today here, Jorge, as well as all the comments in chat about this industry. And so we're going to wrap up the discussion today. about this topic. But before we go, and we're going to have a quick question for one of our panelists, but I also would like to point out a couple of things that folks can do. And nationally right now, there's a lot of blame being put on inaction in Congress and deadlock that's gone on there. And there is, frankly, a lot of that. But President Biden has a lot of power to do things about the climate crisis as the president. And first and foremost, one of our primary demands for President Biden is to declare a climate emergency. And this will give him the power to enact executive actions that will keep fossil fuels in the ground and reject various fossil fuel projects that are under consideration now. And some of this can be done without declaring a climate emergency, but he can do a lot more if he does. And so we'll share a link in chat to that folks can use to send a message to President Biden. But in that regard, there is action in Congress, and it's important that our members of Congress hear from us, because there are opportunities to move policies forward when they come out. And those activities and ideas come forward based on the support that those policies have in Congress as things move forward. And so there's two pieces of legislation I would like to lift up. One is the Future Generation Protection Act, which Representative Schakowsky and Berrigan are the lead sponsors of this legislation, which would ban fracking, end new power plants, and put an end to fossil fuel exports in the United States. To address the climate crisis, it's critical that we embrace these policies that will actually keep fossil fuels in the ground and stop the continuation of this infrastructure. And then another critical piece of legislation is one that Representative Khanna and Senator Booker are partnering on, which is the Farm System Reform Act. And this legislation will stop new factory farms and begin a phase out of factory farming and support a transition to more sustainable pasture-based agricultural systems in rural communities. And so both of these policies, I think, are extremely important to lifting up and showing support within Congress for these policies that are actually going to address the root cause of the climate crisis and enable us as organizers, activists, and lobbyists to actually have more power when we have more constituents on this. So please send these your representatives emails about these policies. Send President Biden an email asking him to address this these issues. And we'll share these links after the action in a follow-up email. So don't worry if you don't get to them right now. And so we're running a little over time. So I appreciate you staying with us. We've gotten similar questions from a lot of folks here today. So I want to make sure we address that before we go. A lot of you asked about other ways you can get involved in these fights, which is awesome to see so many of you ready to take action on this issue. Emma, do you want to share some information about our volunteer network with everyone?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. The first thing you need to know about our volunteer network is that it is the best thing you can do with your time. We have volunteer teams across the country. We have statewide teams. We have local level. I'm sure there's one near you. I think we can pop a link in the chat here so you can find what's happening in your neck of the woods. It really is a great program. We've had pilot projects going across the country for about a year, 2 years now, but we just expanded the program to include a lot more geographical areas. So we really want to be able to pull our supporters and our members in to help us make this very needed change across the country that we have to accomplish in order to address the climate crisis. So I hope you'll consider joining us and joining one of our teams.
Thanks so much, Emma. And we just dropped the link in the chat for where you can look for upcoming volunteer opportunities. So thank you, everyone, for staying on a couple extra minutes to join us for this important conversation. And thank you as well to Jim, Tyler, Jorge, Emma, Jamie, and Mackenzie for being here today. The issues you talked about are so interrelated, and I appreciate you each sharing your perspective on how this not only affects California, but also the states where you live and where some of our members here today live as well. So as they shared, there's a lot of great work being done to pass legislation that would get at the root causes of these issues, stopping fossil fuels, banning factory farms, And that work isn't possible without your support and your willingness to roll up your sleeves and learn more at events like these or contact your members of Congress. So thank you all so much. Again, as Jim mentioned, we will share all those links to take action in a follow-up email along with the recording so that you have some time to contact your members of Congress. Finally, I encourage you to share your feedback later today. You'll receive an email and text message where you can submit a rating and send in any thoughts you had about today's event. So we hope that you'll fill that out. It really helps us inform the content for our upcoming events. And everyone who does will be entered into a drawing to win a Food and Water Watch bandana as a thank you for participating in the survey. So again, keep an eye out for that automated email and text coming a little later this afternoon. So that brings us to the end of our conversation today. So thank you all so much again for being here with us. And I look forward to seeing you at some of our other upcoming events. So thanks and have a great day, everyone.